So yes, today I'd like to talk about environmental monitoring. And I think it's really important for both farmers and commercial applicators to have this information because there's so many media reports about the negative effects of pesticides on the environment. And so applicators and farmers will most likely be asked or even confronted by the public that they are contaminating the environment. And I think it's really important to know what are the levels in the environment. And I'm grateful that the Department of Alberta Environment and Protected Areas continues to monitor pesticides in the environment. And they don't just monitor pesticides, they monitor all kinds of chemicals in surface water especially. And so it gives us a really good idea what's going on, and not only that, but okay, what does this mean when we have certain levels that they're reporting? Is that good, bad, or what does that mean? And so, I hope to be able to share all this with you, and hopefully, you'll come away with much better idea of what's going on in the environment. So, as you all know, once you spray a pesticide, depending on how volatile it is, it may evaporate up into the air, or if you've got a product that's very water soluble, then and not readily absorbed onto surfaces, and especially if it's persistent, you may get leaching down into the soil, maybe even going into groundwater. You can get runoff into surface water, maybe affecting plants and marine life, even getting down in sediments. And of course, you'll get evaporation up back into the air. And and then it can also come down as rain, snow, or even dust. And depending on the specific product, if it's quite resistant, you may have this active ingredient going through several cycles of this throughout the season, maybe even several years. And so this is how pesticides are moved and can get into water. So as I said, Alberta Environment and Protected Areas have been doing environmental monitoring. So they have monitored pesticide in treated water, in surface water, and even in river water. And then once those levels are determined, then they compare those levels to pesticide guidelines that are in place. Now, these are Canadian guidelines that are set by the Canadian Council of Ministers of the Environment. And so the guidelines are in place for drinking water, they're in place for freshwater aquatic life, so to protect the um, invertebrates and animals, fish, and so on that are living in the water, for livestock drinking water, irrigation water, and even recreational water guidelines are in place. So it's great. So then they can compare and know what the levels mean and how much of a concern there should be. So what I'm going to do today is talk first about surface water monitoring, and then talk about treated drinking water monitoring, and then go to river water monitoring, and then lastly, just quickly touch on some implications for applicators. So let's talk about surface water. So here we're meaning lakes, rivers, streams, wetlands, and so on. So the department has been monitoring pesticides in water for a long time. So the first report was for some projects that were done between 1995 and 2002. So they were done mostly in the white zone, so that's the urban and agricultural areas. There were 36 different projects, 326 sites, and 3,000 samples that were taken. So when you look at that map, everywhere there's a square or a dot or circle is where those sampling points occurred. And as you can see, they were various water bodies. They even included irrigation canals, irrigation return flows back to the rivers from where they were taken, and even urban drains, because the department really wanted to have a complete picture of where pesticides are occurring and what those levels were compared to other areas. So this is the result of those that sampling project. So they analyzed for 63 different pesticide active ingredients, and they detected 44 of those. And as you can see from this slide, most of those were herbicides. So 33 of them were herbicides. There were 10 insecticides, 1 fungicide. So in this presentation, I'm going to focus on detection frequency. So the percent of time that this particular pesticide active ingredient was found in the surface water. So the first one that is highlighted here is 2,4-D. So it was showing at 53% of the samples that were taken were showing detectable residues of 2,4-D. The next one is MCPA, so that came in at about 37%. Um, and the next one was glyphosate at a little over 25%, and then MCPP. So MCPP is the active ingredient mecaprop, and that was a really good indicate of the landscape influence. So this would be primarily urban influence in parks and from residential properties and so on. The next one is dicamba, 20%, picloram coming in at about 16%, and then clopyralid, triclopyr, and so on. So you can see they just really dropped right off. And if you're wondering why herbicides were showing up more often, is because primarily in Alberta, it's herbicides that are used. But there were some insecticides that were found. And keep in mind, this is really old data. And so things like lindane showed up at about 3%, diazinon a little bit less than that, and then chlorpyrifos ethyl, which is a breakdown product of chlorpyrifos or your Dursban or Lorsban products and so on. And you can see others were just barely blips. And most of those insecticides are no longer registered and, of course, no longer found. And then one fungicide, carbithion, that was showing up, but just barely a blip. So you can see those levels. And then the other thing they found were 98% of those sites. So remember all of those different 300 and so sites that I showed you in the previous slide. So 98% of those sites had some residues, and 65% of the samples had at least one detection. So very often detected in all of those sites. Now, the good news is the average concentration was 0.09 parts per billion. So if you're wondering what that kind of some reference as to what that might be, is 0.09 part per billion is equivalent to 1 second in 350 years. So you can see very, very low concentration, and that's a really good news, I think. So the next thing was to compare that with those Canadian Council of Ministers of the Environment guidelines. And so you're seeing the same map again, where you see the blue squares. So you can see it a little bit in the central part of the province, and there's a few squares more around the Calgary area and so on. So those were the 3.5% of the samples exceeded the protection of aquatic life guideline. And the active ingredients that were involved in there were 2,4-D. And of course, remember 2,4-D was found most often, but also others like atrazine, dicamba, MCPA, trilate, chlorpyrifos, and lindane. The next one, which showed up much more often, were 27% of the samples exceeded the irrigation guidelines. So irrigation guidelines are in place so that if you have an irrigation system that is very frequently found down in the southern part of the province, they want to keep those levels below the guideline because if a farmer is drawing water from an irrigation canal, and he's growing or she's growing a susceptible crop, then if the guidelines are above, then they may be affecting those sensitive crops. So you can see wherever there is a green triangle, that there were exceedances of the irrigation guidelines for the active ingredients of bromacil, bromoxynil, dicamba, and MCPA. So you can see in the central part, there were a lot of exceedances. Not that there's much irrigation in those areas, but especially in the Battle River, that is a small river body. And just a little bit of residues that make their way into the Battle River will show up, and it'll show up in higher concentrations than when you have a much larger river. You see also a lot of exceedances down in the southern part, and that is more of a concern because that's where most of the irrigation is occurring in Alberta. So that was a concern, and the department did have a lot of communication with the irrigation districts to see what could be done to try to minimize those exceedances. Now, in some cases, there were exceedances of both the protection of aquatic life and the irrigation guidelines, and that was for dicamba and MCPA. And you can see it's this hexagon that is in red. You can see a little bit in the central, and then you can see quite a bit more down in the southern part. But thankfully, only 0.3% of those samples showed that, so that quite low. Now, all the samples were below the livestock drinking guidelines, so that was a plus. But just a caution about the guidelines. They were not available for all of the active ingredients that were tested for, and they only apply to a single compound. So if you had a sample that was analyzed and several active ingredients were found, then there's no indication as to what happens. Is there a cumulative effect, or do they cancel each other out? And so always keep those guidelines in place as to what that might mean. So from the surface water survey over the number of years, what they found is the highest concentrations were found between March and September, with the peak in June and July. And that's not really surprising because that's when most people are applying the pesticides and when it's more likely to come into surface waters. The detection frequency and the concentration and a number detected per sample was highest in irrigation returns. So this is where an irrigation canal that has gone a long ways and has had farmers removing water, and then if there's a significant rain event, some of that water is returned back. So at the end of that canal, this whatever water is left in the canal is returned back to the water body from which it was taken. And so you can expect with all of the intakes and then returns that those levels might be higher. And sure enough, that's what they found. They also found the higher frequencies and concentration in those high intensity agricultural areas. So, as far as the eye can see, it's all agriculture. And so the more often that these pesticides might have been applied in those agricultural areas, the more likely you're going to find that everywhere's in those water bodies. And then the third thing they found is downstream of major urban centers. They found particularly 2,4-D dicamba and mecoprop. And so the urban centers, and I'll show you that a slide in a few slides, they do an upstream sample and they do a downstream sample to show the extent of the influence of urban centers. And then lastly, they found that runoff and rain contributed to the load as well in those areas. So those were the general conclusions. Okay, so let's first talk about agricultural influence. And again, we're talking about detection frequency as a percentage of the number of samples. So here in the top left is the irrigation return flows, and you can see 2,4-D came in at over 90%. Um, so that was quite expected, as I explained as to why this might be higher. And then MCPA was next at about 60%. And then picloram came in very low, and then dicamba, and then you've got mecoprop, because in irrigation canals, it's not only farmers that are pulling water out, but some of the smaller communities will be pulling out water and then returning water back that are in the area of these irrigation canals. That becomes their potable water source. And then the next one that's fairly high, is your glyphosate, coming in at about 38%. Then you've got um, ethylfumicate, which is sugar beet product. So you can see that those levels, they're kind of up and down a little bit, but they're all fairly high. Next, you go to the streams of high intensity, top right. You can see 2,4-D is down at about 65%, MCPA's at about 55%. Picloram is much higher at 40%. So there isn't that concern with irrigation. And so there's a much higher use. And of course, more is found in the water bodies. And then you can see that those levels are quite a bit lower than they were with the irrigation return flows. And then when you get to streams in moderate intensity, so there's a little bit of a mix of urban areas, agriculture, maybe some acreages and so on going on. You can see those levels really start to drop off, where 2,4-D is down at about 35%. Picloram is still fairly high at about 28%. And now you're starting to get the trichoperes starting to pick up because there's a lot more brush control that's going on. And then in low intensity agriculture, that's the bottom right, you can see that those levels are even lower, but then your trichoperes is starting to go up because there's more brush control that's going on. So this gives you a good idea of back then, the agricultural influence. And it's still the same even today, that the more agriculture, the more of an influence there is, and the more of an influence with irrigation return flows. The next one is pesticides in surface water. Now, this is the chart for Edmonton, but Calgary was very similar. Lethbridge is a little bit different because there's a lot more agriculture upstream from Lethbridge, whereas Edmonton and Calgary have much lower influence. Again, we're talking detection percentage. You can see the purple bar is the upstream, and then the dark blue bar is downstream from Edmonton. So you can see 2,4-D was 20% upstream, and then it's almost 70% downstream. So a huge influence from urban pesticide application that includes 2,4-D in the mix. The next one is the mecaprop, very low upstream and approaching 60% downstream, and CPA that is an influence as well, not near as much. So you can see these are active ingredients that you're primarily going to find in products like Killex and so on. And so they're actively used, and you can see them showing up significantly in downstream samples. Now, you remember this data is quite old, and you saw lindane and diazinon. Lindane was actually used to control scabies and lice on humans, and you can see that that effect is showing up in water because after they treat the sewer water, some of that is returned back into the river waters. So one of the issues with urban pesticide application is, in order to get a lush green lawn like what you're seeing in this picture, oftentimes those domestic application rates are higher than agricultural rates, and they can be applied up to 4 times a year. And so the more often you use it, the more likely you're going to see those residues show up. The other thing that is a factor in urban is there's actually no buffer zone between the lawns and catchment basin. So if it comes off the lawn, it goes directly into the catchment basin, and it goes into the stormwater system for that municipality, and it drains directly into the water. And so there's no vegetation buffer that is present that you can see, that you have in a lot of agricultural areas. Okay, so that was surface water. Now I'm going to shift to drinking water monitoring. So drinking water monitoring is water that has been removed from the environment and has been treated, and that's what comes out of your tap. So it was pretty much the same time frame as you can see, 95 to 2003. In these cases here, you can see that, again, we're talking detection frequency as a percentage, and you can see those levels are much lower. They analyzed for 63 compounds, detected 19, and 26% of those samples did actually show active ingredients present. So again, herbicides will dominate, but there's still 4 insecticides that are showing up. So 240 is still highest at about 17, 18%. MCPA at 11%. Your mecaprop is about 4%. And you can see the other active ingredients are dropping off pretty significantly. And even the insecticide, you see linden is showing up at, you know, maybe half of a percent. So not very much at all. But, it is important to note that the water is treated, but not all of the pesticides are removed from the treated drinking water. Now, the good news is that the average concentration in drinking water at that time was 0.05 parts per billion. So again, very, very low levels, but it's it is low. And the second thing is that it is 100% compliant with the drinking water guidelines. So even though there's minute amounts of pesticides in there, it's safe to use, whether it's, just a newborn infant or somebody that's, and healthy, or even somebody that's old and is having some health issues. It is compliant and it is safe for all of those people. So the general provisions that they found is that they found pesticide, oops, sorry, let's back up here. They found pesticides were detected year round. And so what happens is when they remove this water from, say, a river or so on, it goes into a reservoir. They call it a raw water reservoir, and it's kept there. And in these reservoirs, there's no biological activity going on. It's basically a pit of water, and so whatever was in that water when it was put into the reservoir, that's it, just sits there. There's no breakdown of that pesticides at all, and that's why you find it year round. And of course, as I said already, the treatment process does not remove all residues. I think they're getting a little bit better, but I just don't have the new water treatment results to share with you. But yeah, it is what it is, and we know from back then that the levels are very low. Of course, uh, the differences were found depending on usage pattern and intensity of pesticides that were applied. So in areas where there's this high intensity agriculture, and there were treated water plants, the levels going into the plant is higher. So you might get a little bit higher level than in areas where there's very little agriculture. And I guess the take home message is that all the detection levels were compliant with the Canadian Drinking Water Guidelines. Okay, so now we're going to shift to river water monitoring. So starting in 2003 up until 2016, what the department did is they shifted away from that massive project because it was very, very expensive to do 326 sites. And so they stopped doing that, and they instead focused on long-term monitoring sites. So there were 28 sites established across the province, and you can see that on that map. Wherever there's a circle, square, or triangle is where they were monitoring. And they were looking at rivers in all watersheds across Alberta. So you can see here, you see some of the smaller rivers, the Wapiti and the Smoky up north, to the Peace River. You see the Athabasca River here. You see the North Saskatchewan River here, the Battle River, the Red Deer River. You can see the Bow River down south, the Oldman River, and South Saskatchewan, and so on. So all of the watersheds were sampled from. They were sampling 4 times a year, so May, June, July, and August. And they picked the 20 most often found pesticides. So that worked out to 15 herbicides and 5 insecticides. So this is the map that they were showing of results. Again, we're talking detection percentages in these 2,279 samples. So still a large number of samples, but now over quite a bit a longer time frame, you can see that 2,4-D is still showing up at about 39%, MCPA at about 22%. Glyphosate was showing up at about 23%. Now, unfortunately, in 2012, they stopped analyzing for glyphosate. It's a very, very expensive and analytical process that glyphosate requires. The other thing is we all know that when glyphosate is sprayed and it gets onto soil, it's very tightly bound. And so it's not biologically active for the most part. There's a little bit of research to show that there might be a little bit of activity, but for the most part, especially in 2012, money was tight. And so they thought, if it's not biologically active, maybe we're just not going to test for it so that we have more money to analyze in a long-term process. And so that's as far as we got in 2012. But all the other ones, the other active ingredients continue to be monitored. You can see Mecaprop is coming in at about 14%, and then the others are kind of tailing off as you go down. And wherever you see this NLR, that's no longer registered. So I just wanted to put that there so you had a little bit more of an idea of the active ingredients. So these were the 20 active ingredients that were being sampled at the time. And so, they're similar to the active ingredients from the 95 to 2002 projects. So now I'm going to give you the average concentration in parts per billion that were found for these active ingredients. So even though 2,4-D was being found at about 40%, you can see that the parts per billion were very, very low for 2,4-D. Same thing with MCPA. You found it very often, but those levels are very, very low that they're finding. Now, when it came to glyphosate, those levels are higher, so 0.43 parts per billion, so significantly higher than something like 2,4-D. Chlorpyrrolid was at 0.9, and another pretty high concentration, relatively speaking, was Diuron or Crovar. You could see that came in at about 0.38 parts per billion. Now, you can see that most of those active ingredients are actually coming in below 0.05, which is a good thing. And if you average them all out, it comes out to 0.07 parts per billion. Keeping in mind that glyphosate hasn't been included since 2012. And actually, glyphosate was one of the ones that were really high even in 1995 to 2003. So when you remove that, it has a significant effect. And so if you remember back, it was 0.09 in 95 to 2003, and now we're seeing it at 0.07 parts per billion. So you're actually seeing a little bit of a reduction. So I think that's positive. So the next slide is the percent detections over time. Again, we're still talking those original active ingredients. And I've gone back and grabbed the data from 1995 to 2002, and we go all the way up to 2023. So you can see here that the percent detected kind of varied a little bit. So 2,4-D, it started at over 40, and then there was a little bit of a blip in 2006 to 10, and then it dropped a little bit in 2011 to 15, and it dropped again from 2017 to 2023. So you can see there's just a little bit of a decline, not much, only about 5%. Mecaprop, on the other hand, has been declining from 95 to now it's only at about 7% in the last 5 years. When it comes to MCPA, you can see that it is slightly increasing, but not a huge amount, only about 2-3%. Dicamba, you can see it kind of went up and then it came back down. Clopyrrolid or your Lontrel, you can see that has been going down over the years. Picloram, is surprisingly has been actually going up a little bit, from about 4 to about 10%. Um, and then you can see the others, it's a lot less of an effect over time for those 20 active ingredients. Now, in 2017, the department decided to really expand this project, and it continues to date. Now, the one thing I just want to identify here is the 2023 data. I've lumped it in from 2017 to 2023 as a sort of a lumped amount. It's still temporary. They're probably not going to make that as final data for maybe a month or two, but I thought it was important to pardon me, include it. So they're still using the long-term monitoring of those 28 sites across Alberta, still the same watersheds being sampled, but now they've increased it to 5 times a year. So they're including September because we all know that there can be significant amount of pesticide application that goes on in the fall, especially in no-till operations. And so they wanted to include September. Now they've included 93 active ingredients, and in some cases they're metabolites. So 45 herbicides, 31 insecticides, and 17 fungicides. So significant increase in those numbers, or those active ingredients. So there were 73 new active ingredients. 877 samples were taken over those 6-year period. And the good news is 48 of those new active ingredients had no detectable residues at all. So 66% of those. 23 active ingredients had less than 5% detections. So that's 32% of those. And 2 active ingredients had greater than 5% detection. So let's just dive in a little bit further with these ones here. So here, these are just the new active ingredients because I've already talked about the original 20. Pardon me. So this is some of the listing of the ones where there were um, some detections. You can see there's a few exceedances, but as I said, most of them are below 5%. So that's really good. And then you've got these few that are above. So you've got aminopyrrolid or milestone herbicide. You've got dieldrin, which is, even though it's no longer registered, it's still showing up. And then you've got fluroxypyr, and that's the active ingredient in sightline and starine. And of course, a herbicide. So when you look at aminopyrrolid, I'm just going to dive in a little bit more on that one. It's the active ingredient in milestone, reclaim, restore, clearview, and so on. It's primarily for industrial vegetation, but also for rangeland and pasture. Now, there's not a lot of aminopyrrolid containing herbicides that are sold in Alberta. In 2018, the department indicated that about 9,700 kilograms of active ingredient were sold. So, it is kind of surprising to see it showing up that much. The next one is dieldrin. As I said, it's no longer registered. Actually, hasn't been registered since 1990. It is still showing up in the environment because it's highly resistant to degradation, and it just doesn't break down. So that's why you're seeing it. The next one is fluroxypyr. Now, in 2018, there was significantly more fluroxypyr that was sold. So 263,000 kilograms of active ingredient sold in Alberta in 2018. And so just like everything else, the more often that a product is used, the more likely you're going to see detections. That's I think partly why you see this active ingredient. It is quite water soluble and it will move. So that's why you're seeing that coming up. So then now I want to shift to the average concentration, so you get to see how much of this is getting into river water. So as you can see, most of them are below or at 0.04 parts per billion, so that's good. And but some are higher. So you can see that there's three that are significantly above that. But the total average concentration is 0.035. So if you, combine all of those active ingredients, it's 0.035. So that's even less than those 20 originals. So I think that's a good news. So let's look at, we talked already about milestone. Um, so one of the things with milestone is that it is actually quite persistent in aerobic aquatic systems, which would be like a river or a water. The half-life can be between 462 days to 980 days. And pardon me, sorry. So, that's probably why you're seeing those amounts. However, the levels are still quite low. The no observable effect level for the most susceptible aquatic invertebrate is 1.36 milligrams of active ingredient. So milligrams is parts per million, which is significantly higher than what you're seeing here. Sorry, I have a bit of a cold here. All right, the next one is clodinafop. So even though it didn't show up very often, the levels that it was showing up is about 0.09 parts per billion. So that's 25,000 kilograms of active ingredient. Geez, sorry. Were sold in 2018. Um, and the no observable effect level for an aquatic species like Daphne is 16 parts per billion. So, you're way, way lower than that no observable effect level. And then the last one is tebuconazole, or sorry, Raxol product, and it's showing up at about 0.17 parts per billion. That's a seed treatment foliar application as well. It is persistent and it will carry over. The no observable effect concentration for freshwater midge is 1.52 milligrams of active ingredient per liter. So that's parts per million. We're talking parts per billion, so significantly lower than any effect that's going to affect those freshwater susceptible species. All right, so the next slide here is just showing I've combined those 20 originals with the new ones, and you can see those levels. So there's a good mix of both the 20 original, that's the green bars, and the purple bars, that's the new ones. And just to see the most often found active ingredients. So 2,4-D, MCPA, your fluroxapyr, that's one of the new ones. Aminopyrrolid comes in next. And then picloram, which was one of the original ones as well. And then mecaprop, and then the rest just are below 5% detections. So if you've combined them, you can see that the concentration do vary a significant amount. But as I said before, all those levels are really quite low and below 0.04 for most of them. If you add both the old and the new together, then the total average concentration is 0.05 parts per billion. So that's, I think, really good news going forward. So going on then, I looked at the detections by region for 2003 right up to 2023. So the north includes the Peace River, Athabasca, Smoky, and Wapiti. So you can see that's the blue bar there. The next one is the orange bar. That's North Saskatchewan River. The next one is the Red Deer and Battle Rivers. And then the south is the lighter Orange Bar, South Saskatchewan, Milk Bow, and Old Man Rivers. So you can see that as you head from the north going south, those levels drastically increase from about 1 or 2% to about 23% detections for 2,4-D. You see the same sort of thing for Mecaprop, your landscape indicator. MCPA is a little bit different. You don't see very high levels for the north and the North Saskatchewan, but you can see that in the central and south, significantly more use. Piclorum really just sees a higher level in the central, and I think that's more because the Red Deer and the Battle Rivers are smaller, and so it would seem to be concentrated because of the smaller water volume of water. Dicamba, you can see that as you go south, those levels increase. Clopyralid, same sort of deal. Triclopyr, you can see most of that is in the north and North Saskatchewan, but very little in the south. And then glyphosate, yeah, I really, think the lab had some difficulties there because you could see really high in the north, and it kind of seems to be increasing going further south. And again, those results only went to 2012. And then from 2017 to 2023, these were the new active ingredients. The ones that showed up were aminopyrrolid. You can see here um, that it's most often found in the central, maybe the same sort of thing that's happening as compared to piclorum. With fluroxypyr, you can see, it's about 4% in a piece, drops down at North Saskatchewan, but is higher again in the central and south, and a little bit of quinclorac and tebuconazole. So the urban influence continues to be very similar to what I showed you from 95 to 2002. The blue bar is upstream and the orange bar is downstream. So you can see it goes from for 2,4-D, about 15% upstream in Edmonton to over 70% downstream. Mecaprop is the same, um, up about 43% downstream. Same thing with MCPA. And then you can see that fluroxypyr has a similar profile, very low upstream and about 43% downstream. So you can see that urban influence continues to date. When you look at it over time, you can see right from 95 all the way to 2023, 2,4-D seem to be increasing. And then in the last 6 years, there's been a slight decrease. The Mecaprop, you can see it has been pretty stable over the years. MCPA kind of dropped down and then popped back up. Piclorum has been increasing downstream from Edmonton. Dicamba, you can see, a little bit of a blip came down again. Lindane is no longer registered. I'm not sure why they're seeing a little blip there in 2017. And then you can see the fluroxypyr. That's just new, so that's why you're just getting the blue bars. So Calgary is similar to Edmonton. Grand Prairie similar. But for cities like Red Deer and Lethbridge, where there's a lot of upstream agriculture, you see a bit of a different profile. So you can see 2,4-D for Lethbridge in the Old Man River, about 60% because there's a lot of agriculture upstream, but you can still see that urban influence. So it jumps over about 75%. Same thing with MCPA. Um, Not so much of a Mecaprop influence, so that's kind of interesting. But then you can see this fairly significant influence with dicamba, and you see the same thing with fluroxypyr. when you look at urban influence over time, you can see with 2,4-D, it kind of went up and then down, and then in the last 6 years, it's been creeping back up again. With Megaprop, it dropped from that 95 to 2003, and it seems to have been fairly stable. I'm not sure why 2011 to 15 is not showing up, but it seems to be fairly stable. MCPA seems to be a little bit on the rise, about 10%. Dicamba was going down, but then you can see that it is climbing back up. And of course, fluoroxypyr, we just have the 2017 to 23 data. So, okay, I've given you lots of information here, and how is that complying with the Canadian Council of Ministers of the Environment guidelines? So, good news, all samples were lower than the human drinking water guidelines. They were lower than the livestock drinking water guidelines, and they were lower than the protection of aquatic life guidelines. So that's really good news. Now, unfortunately, the irrigation guidelines were an exception to that, and especially for MCPA and dicamba. So you can see 95 to 2002, those exceedances were about 4%. And then with MCPA, that's the orange bar, you can see they dropped down from 2001 to 25. They popped back up to 3% in the following 5 years. Then they dropped back down to 1% in 2011 to 15. And then they're up again to 3% exceedances. Dicamba took a different route. It went up and it stayed up till about 2010. Then it dropped down to about 4% from 2011 to 15, and then it's dropped back down. So you can see they're kind of meeting at about 3% exceedances um, for the irrigation guidelines. So again, same caution. We still don't have guidelines for all of those active ingredients. They're only determined for single active ingredients. And again, we don't know what happens when there's more active ingredient in a sample than just the one. So is it a synergistic effect? So they actually are enhanced effects, or antagonistic, so they actually cancel each other out. But what we did see is that 49% of the samples had at least two active ingredients, 19% had three active ingredients, and 5% had four active. And usually what they found was 2,4-D with either MCPA at 50% of those samples, fluoroxypyr at about 35%, picloram at 25%, or mecaprop at 21, and or dicamba at 13%. So you can see that these active ingredients, they're oftentimes most often sold in Alberta, and you can see they're finding their way into water at low levels, but they're still coming there. So just to end off here, so what are the implications for you as applicators? So we all know that the largest contributors are applications near water, because they're more likely to result in runoff and drift into water. So you see this field here, and right at the bottom here, you can see there's a bit of a wetland. There's some standing water, and of course, a lot of weeds. And the temptation is to swing the boom over to try to get rid of the weeds. And of course, the closer you get, the more likely it's going to come into the water. And in this case here, there's very little vegetation to stop the runoff. So it's important to manage those riparian areas, ideally by planting a vegetation strip. And you see that coming up in a lot of the labels now, where they're recommending vegetation strips around those water bodies as much as possible. The other thing too is you're seeing a lot of labels specified aquatic buffer zones. So in this picture on the left, you can see that this brush was controlled right on the edge, and that is something that those buffer zones are saying you need to stay further back in order to prevent pesticide from getting in the water. And same thing on this roadside here. You can see that the herbicide was applied, and there is a significant water body here, and the buffer zones should have been applied. And in this case, it doesn't appear that they were. The next one, a lot of the labels are now recommending use of coarse spray nozzles and the lowest recommended pressure to reduce drift. So you can see here, wherever you see the C, that's the type of nozzle and pressure that will give you those coarse spray nozzles. Um, and then the other one is to try as much as possible to do spot treatments to prevent, rather than boom applied, prevent movement of contaminated water off the property and into the water body. And of course,
Vivian, you're muted. Just this last bullet.
You're still muted, Vivian.
okay, can you hear me now? Sorry about that. I'm not sure what happened there. Okay, so you can follow all the bullets there, I'm sure. So the other sources of contamination, especially to water bodies, or when a significant rainfall occurs after an application. And I know during a spray season, it gets really difficult to try to get all the applications happening when it's necessary. But when you get some of these really significant rain events happening, you can get significant runoff, as you can see in this picture on the right here. And it's one thing if it goes onto terrestrial land, causing vegetation damage, but also if it gets into water, that is something that is not a good thing. Okay, and not only does the runoff can lead to pesticide getting into water, but also it can move soil. So any pesticides that's adsorbed onto soil will also move. So there's kind of a double whammy going on when this water is moving after a rainfall event. And of course, the Blue Book gives you some rain-free periods to try to adhere to, so that the pesticide that you've applied is going to stay where you want it to and provide the control that you're wanting. And this is just an example of some of those rain-free periods that are specified in the Blue Book. All right, so that's the end of my presentation, and maybe we can, I don't know if you were able to add my questions, and we can do the first questions maybe, and have people answer that first question.
Yeah, we'll launch the first question now.
So the question is, what is the current average concentration of combined active ingredients found in Alberta's river water from 2017 to 2023? So if you can go ahead and submit your vote, if you can remember what that was. All right, so I've got 56% coming in at 0.05, and that is correct. That is the concentration that is found overall in the last 6 years. So that's actually really good. And if you remember back to that earlier data from 95 to 2002, it was 0.09. So we've actually seen a reduction from there. So that's another good news. So yeah, if you can post a second question. Okay, so maybe this one here, I'm not sure if you can read uh, the uh, the active ingredients there. Um, so the choices are 2,4-D and MCPA, fluroxypyr, aminopyrrolide, and picloram. as your potential choices, and kind of running a little bit out of time here, so I'm going to give you the answer. And it's actually all of those are the ones, the active ingredients that are most often detected in river water. And so, if you are using those active ingredients, maybe just look at your application practices and see if there's any situation where you might be able to reduce those applications near water to try to keep those numbers as low as possible. And if we could just post the last question. Okay, this one is which of the following practices help prevent pesticides from getting into water? And oh gosh, I can't even read those. But basically, it's the last slide that where I was talking about um, just trying to manage those applications near water. And sorry, let me go back here to my presentation. And follow label buffer zones, use coarse nozzles, try to do spot treatment near water, and follow wind speed restrictions on the label. The one choice there, if anybody can read it, said use fine spray nozzles, and no, you don't want to do that, but you want to do the others. So yeah, everybody looked like they were doing pretty good with that. So I will turn it back over to you.
Okay. There was one question in the chat, and it was along the lines of, with the slides from 2012 showing pesticide in the water, the ones that are no longer registered, were they NLR then and still showing up, or NLR presently?
Okay, so let's go back to 2012. Yeah, definitely from 2003 to 23, there's a lot of active ingredients that are no longer registered. But things like diuron was showing up until about 6 years ago, and then then we're not seeing it anymore. So just depending on how resistant those are, is how long they actually were detected. So a lot dropped off as within a year or two after they were no longer registered.
Okay. Is there still products that are showing up in the water that are no longer registered? And what's the reason why they're still showing up now?
I think they're pretty much all gone from what I can see. There was, you saw the one slide there with the urban drains where you had lindane showing up. I think that maybe just part of my analytics that had a bit of a problem there, because lindane hasn't been registered for many years. So that I think is just a blip that is something more with my analysis than anything. So the answer would be no.
Okay, if there any other questions, either from, I don't see anything in the chat, but if anyone has their hand up or would like to ask a question, you're welcome to do so. Okay. I will take
All
that
right,
as a
thanks.
no. Oh, there is
Okay.
one, sorry. Why is glyphosate no longer being tested in the current surveys?
Well, it continues to be a very expensive analysis, and as I said before, uh, the it's been we know it to bind strongly to soil, and it becomes no longer biologically available to have a herbicide effect. And so based on that, they stopped doing it in 2012, and looks like they're continuing to stop doing it. So that's, I guess, the only information I have as to why not.
Okay, perfect. Thanks so much for your time and your presentation, Vivian. Really appreciate it.